When you think of Family Feuds, normally you think about something like the Hatfields and McCoys, clans fighting up in Appalachia, but about a year ago I did a video on the Barber-Mizell feud here in Florida. What I found was that a lot of these families, especially ones from Appalachia, decided to move down to Florida right after the Civil War to carve out a name for themselves. It wasn't quite a frontier, but a lot of people treated it as if it were one. Now, I want you to imagine a feud that dwarfed the Hatfields and McCoys that happened right here around Tampa Bay. This is a totally separate fight that took dozens of lives according to some accounts, but other accounts say it only took a couple. Now, this really begins with the deputy sheriff who's buried here beside me. He was killed on July 4th, 1893. I want you to picture the atmosphere. There's a huge party, and all of these Tarpon Springs sponge fishermen, they're celebrating. It's a day of celebration. And one of them, a man named Robert Atwell, gets a little bit drunk, and the sheriff deputy decides to go and arrest him. Naturally, he doesn't want to be taken without a fight, and his two friends see the deputy trying to arrest him, and they start muscling their way over. And you can always tell when a fight's about to begin. What you quickly discover when researching Family Feuds like this is that a million different names are involved. That actually contributes to the obscene levels of violence that they always seem to turn into. Now, that deputy sheriff, William Erastus Whitehurst, was trying to arrest the sponge fisherman Robert Atwell. His two friends, Constance or just Bud Stevenson, and John S. McNeil tried to prevent that arrest. They moved in, they started roughing up the deputy sheriff, and guns were drawn. Well, Stevenson took a shot to the face and was gravely wounded but didn't die, and the deputy sheriff fell dead where he stood. He was also the town marshal of Tarpon Springs. Now, what normally happens after the initial killing that sparks a feud is a rigged jury or a real division between townspeople. And that's exactly what happened at the trial in 1894. The jury found the duo guilty, but recommended mercy, so they saved them from the gallows. But only a month after that trial ended, the judge declared a mistrial, and this allowed both men to walk free. That was the beginning of this brutal family feud, which some say killed dozens of people. It was actually called the Whitehurst-Whiddon-Stevenson feud. Stevenson, of course, after the man who killed the deputy Whitehurst, but other families would get involved very, very quickly over time. Usually families entrenched in county-level politics as judges, as constables, as sheriffs and mayors. And I'll kind of tell you a little bit more about how this feud played out, but this cemetery has quite a few members of the Whitehurst family buried here. And the more I dig into the meat of this feud, the more I discover that the Whitehurst family was deeply entrenched in local politics. This is the grave of Elbert Whitehurst, the brother of the deputy who was killed on the 4th of July, 1893. He was involved in the raid on Bud Stevenson's home, the raid which killed a 19-year-old. He was quickly arrested, but just as quickly he was released. Then you've got John Stevenson Whitehurst, who's buried just outside of this cemetery, sort of on the outskirts of Tampa. He was the mayor of Plant City, and the deputy himself was the town marshal of Tarpon Springs. Behind us, we've got another Whitehurst, who was the first sheriff of Pinellas County. Obviously, you've got all of this deeply entrenched power in this one family, when a lot of people feel, especially the poor folks who just moved in, that they're kind of pushing them around a little bit. Now, that was just a public opinion. It's the same way that people felt about the McCoys and the Hatfields when one family gained a little bit more power over the other. While that duo, the Friends of the Sponge Fishermen, were awaiting trial for the murder of the Marshal of Tarpon Springs, 19-year-old Henry Taylor Austin was killed by an angry armed mob. The 15 or so masked men wanted to avenge the deputy's death by killing Bud Stevenson, but only wounded him in the raid of his home. Sadly, Henry Austin was just an unintended casualty, Bud Stevenson's younger cousin. He was asleep when a bullet killed him. By the time the two men were set loose after the murder trial, some in the community felt that Stevenson had already been punished enough. His cousin had been killed for no real reason, and it was obvious to some that law and order meant nothing if a mob intended to kill a man who was standing trial. Lines were drawn, and Stevenson was given a second trial just before Christmas 1894. By that time, public sentiment had shifted, and he was again acquitted. Friends of the deputy and Marshal of Tarpon Springs, Whitehurst, were now out for blood, and chief among them were the Whidden family, his own cousins. And in the same cemetery as some of the feud victims are a couple unknown graves. There's one here, and the one that I saw immediately after I got out of my car up here. Last time I was in Florida talking about the Dominickers, a strange ethnic group that mostly has disappeared now in the Florida Panhandle. They told me that a lot of these cemeteries have unknowns, people who were just passing through, people who died in the turpentine camps and had no records with them, which goes more to tell the fact that those turpentine camps were basically slave labor camps. Who knows who these people are, really? Here at the West Elfers Cemetery in Pasco County, the Whidden family has a couple of graves, and it seems like they were on the faction of the slain Marshal Whitehurst. By the time they were killed, on July 23rd, 1895, so a little over 2 years since the town marshal was killed, papers claim that Crockett and Daniel Whidden had killed up to a half-dozen people. Now, the note that I have written down here is that just after 1 a.m. on July 23rd, 1895, Crockett and Daniel were sleeping in a turpentine camp along the Cootie River in this county. As feudists, they supposedly murdered more than a half-dozen men that belonged to the Stevenson faction. They were employers, they actually ran the turpentine camp, and that would have made them very hated. Because if you know anything about labor history in the Deep South, you would know that the turpentine camps were very corrupt. They would oftentimes use prison labor, and that entailed working with the sheriff to just round up people you didn't like in the county, people who were lounging around. You would accuse them of loitering, you would pick up blacks, and you would just put them to work in the turpentine camp. So these were essentially two camp guards who had quite a few murders under their belts, although I can't really find out who specifically they killed. That night, a half-dozen men rode into the camp and, quote, shot them to pieces. A 2014 newspaper claims they were the cousins of the slain Marshal Whitehurst. And next to Daniel and Crockett Whidden, you've got Jim Whidden with no date of death, and I can't find anything about him. You've also got James Whidden and his wife, Mary Thomas, who both died in 1882. I can find no information about them either. And this is the very small Whidden plot. It looks like Howell Whidden is the last man to be buried here, a veteran of the U.S. Army in Korea, and his relatives over here, veterans of the family feuding of the 1890s. I just kind of want to point something out a little interesting. Here you've got Crockett and Daniel Whidden, who were fighting because they were cousins of the sheriff. Now, the opposing side of the sheriff was the Stevenson family, and a lot of the graves in this cemetery actually belong to the Stevensons. So much like the Hatfield and McCoy feud, some people not siding against their families, but understanding that their family was very violent, trying to bridge gaps. And so you've got Hatfield graves inside of McCoy cemeteries. You've got Stevenson graves right next to Whidden graves, even though they fought against each other. And by the way, just a little interesting, here is the grave of John Pinder, who died in 1902. He was born in 1854 in the Bahamas and was a sailor for much of his life. And in the same cemetery, in the shadow of the Whidden plot, is the first grave to be dug here. It belongs to P.K. Bailey, a native of Scotland who moved to Valdosta, and he's what you would actually call a cracker. Now, there's some misconceptions about crackers. A lot of people think that it is a sort of pejorative against white people because they were cracking the whip, and that's half true. It was used to actually refer to people who would move from Georgia down to Florida on cattle drives, so that would have been P.K. Bailey. And as far as crackers go, it was kind of a unique subset of cowboy. They were the poorest of the poor. They would have otherwise worked in lumber camps, and they had their own very honorable society. There's a lot of folk legends about them, and it looks like one of his relatives also served
the Confederacy. He died in 1899.
By mid-1896, the feud had reached a fever pitch, and on June 10th, less than 2 weeks after the previous feud trouble, John W. Crum was assassinated as he returned from a state Democratic convention. This sort of changed the dynamic of the feud. Prior to this, it was the Whitehurst faction, and the Whitehursts were mostly involved with local politics. These men were deputies, they were sheriffs, they were mayors, they were town marshals. And it was them versus sort of the criminal, or at least the working class element of society and their supporters. But of course, as always, the upper class has a few supporters as well, even amongst the lower class. But when they killed Crum, the man who was implicated was a Whidden boy. Now, the Whiddens were cousins of the deputy who was killed in 1893. This event sparked the feud. So now you've got people who are killing local politicians who are also pretty well wrapped up in the goings-on of day-to-day life. And after this point, a lot of people who had supported the Whitehurst faction, and by extension the Whiddens, who were killing members of the Stevenson faction, began to question their alliances, and as things shifted over to more political-based killings, a lot of people began to wonder what exactly this feud was all about.
And this is the grave of John David Crum, who died November 10th, 2017. Obviously, he wasn't wrapped up in this feud, but I show you that to show you this. This entire section of the cemetery here is mostly Crum burials. The family was incredibly prominent in the local area, and naturally a lot of them were landowners, planters, politicians. This is the grave of Anne and John W. Crum, and Anne's father, that would be John's stepfather, is buried right over here. He died a couple of years before this feud took off, but his story is equally fascinating, and it kind of shows a little bit how the family here was wrapped up in the earliest settlement of this part of Florida. So John Crum was assassinated in 1896, but his stepfather, his wife's father, David Hope, he died in 1879 of natural causes, a very elderly man, but you can see why a lot of locals would support the Hope and Crum families. They were some of the earliest settlers, and David Hope had participated in the Seminole Wars, deciding to just stay in the area after the war. Then he joined the Confederacy in the Civil War and fought apparently pretty valiantly because the Union came and burned down his plantation after the war was over. So naturally, when you have the Whiddens, supposedly, I don't believe that was ever proven, killing this man's stepson, a lot of people who supported the Whidden faction or the Whitehurst faction began to question their alliances now that it was also claiming the lives of people who were deemed the sons and son-in-laws of valiant, good Southern Democrats. So obviously the Hope family, being some of the earliest settlers of the area after the Seminole Wars, were very prominent in local goings-on, but the first burial here is that of Charlotte Wynne Piles Crum, and naturally the Hopes married into the Crums, but she was killed because her husband had settled the local plot of land after the Occupation Act of 1842, and the local Seminoles didn't realize the war was over, and they shot her, and it created quite a stir in the aftermath of the Second Seminole War. On February 3rd, 1897, Constantine Bud Stevenson was killed at Hudson from an ambush attack. A later newspaper article reported, quote, Stevenson was planting a watermelon patch at the time of the shooting, and his 2 daughters were in the field with him. When he jumped over the fence, he fell before his wife reached him with the gun, but died before he could use it. Ever since the killing of Whitehurst at Tarpon Springs 3 years ago, Stevenson has carried his gun regularly, and it is said that this is the first day he had ever been without it. Other papers claim that Stevenson had killed 2 of the Whidden brothers. Once Bud Stevenson had been murdered in front of his wife and daughters, the news around town was that the Whidden brothers vowed to kill him after Stevenson got away with killing one of their men on his front porch. That man's name was J.W. Whitehurst. Bud Stevenson was acquitted for that crime, but the Whiddens promised vengeance, often and loudly, and it seems like that's what happened, February 3rd, 1897.
And in the same Whitehurst family plot, we have the grave of Willard Walton Whitehurst, who, on that fateful day, fled to Tampa with Tillit Whidden. And they surrendered to the sheriff because they felt they could get a fair shake in that city. Now behind him is buried his brother, the deputy who was killed in that initial shootout in 1893, and right next to him is another brother, Erastus Whitehurst, who was involved with the shooting of the 19-year-old. And right behind him is Marvel Whitehurst, a Coast Guard veteran and the first sheriff of Pinellas County. So you can see, obviously, they had a real grip on local power. A lot of people felt some kind of way about that.
And in the same Whitehurst family plot, you've got another interesting local grave. I thought this man might have been involved with a very late stage of the feud, but apparently he was 21 years old when there was a shooting gallery at the beach, and he was an attendant there, and one of the soldiers accidentally, supposedly, misfired his gun and killed him. Then that soldier fled, and there was a bit of a scramble to find out where he was, but it seems like Willard Williams, or WW, or Bill Schaefer, was killed in 1941